I was in the cabin when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice slide through the half-open door like a blade through silk. Tonight, we push her off the yacht and claim the $3 billion. Her tone was sweet, almost musical, as if she were reading a bedtime story. My son's voice followed low, uncertain then calm. She's too frail to fight back anyway. A pause. The clink of glasses. Laughter. I froze, every sound in my body dying, except the thudding in my chest. The sea outside was calm, gentle, the kind of calm that only hides a storm. I looked at my shaking hands and whispered, "So this is how it ends, killed by the people I fed." Then I pressed my fingers against the recorder hidden in my pillbox, and let it run. The yacht hummed softly beneath my feet, each vibration steady as a heartbeat. I sat still, forcing my breathing quiet the way I used to when Robert, my husband, practiced target shooting in the yard and told me patience could win wars. Above me, laughter rose again, drifting down the stairwell with the smell of champagne and sea salt. They thought I was asleep, old, medicated. They had no idea the woman they planned to murder had built an empire before they learned to spell the word inheritance. I waited until the footsteps moved toward the deck before I stood. My reflection in the mirror startled me, gray hair, pale skin, the soft face of a grandmother. But beneath it I saw the woman who had once fought boardrooms of men twice her age and never blinked. "Not tonight," I whispered. "Not me." The afternoon light filtered through the window, turning the water outside silver and calm. Ethan had called me earlier that morning, sounding almost tender. "Mom, Vanessa wants to celebrate your recovery. Just us, like old times." I wanted to believe him. After all, he hadn't called in months without talking about company shares or taxes. My heart, still healing from surgery, ached for that small hope. Maybe this time he wanted his mother, not her money. I had said yes immediately. I told Lydia, my housekeeper, "It'll be good to breathe sea air again." She had frowned, always too perceptive. "Sea air or trouble, Mrs. Grant?" I laughed then, too naively. By evening I was dressed in my navy dress, the one Robert said made my eyes look like stormwater before sunrise. I wore his old silver scarf around my neck, a habit that always comforted me. When I reached the marina, the Silver Swan gleamed under the Seattle sun, sleek, expensive, heartless. Ethan waited by the gangway in a crisp white shirt. "Mom, you look beautiful," he said, smiling too wide. When he hugged me, his arms felt hollow. Vanessa followed behind him, her red lipstick sharp against her tanned skin, sunglasses reflecting the sea. "You're glowing," she said, pressing a mimosa into my hand. "Let's toast to health and happiness." As the yacht pulled away from the dock, the city faded into a watercolor blur. The water shimmered silver under the sky, and for a moment I almost believed in peace. Vanessa sat across from me, legs crossed, eyes unreadable. "You've done so much, Mom. You should think about slowing down, letting the next generation take over the business." I smiled lightly. "You mean the generation sitting in front of me?" She laughed, soft and dangerous. "Of course. You don't want all that paperwork when you could be resting. It's complicated, bank transfers, new tax laws. Let us handle it. I'm still clear enough to sign my own checks, Vanessa." She tilted her head, smiling wider. "Of course. It's just, sometimes recovery affects short-term memory, doesn't it? You wouldn't want to forget anything important." A chill ran down my spine. I noticed her phone propped on the table, camera facing me. "Selfies?" I asked. "Just memories," she said smoothly. I took a sip of the drink she gave me, sweet, too sweet, and set it down. "Memories," I repeated. "Those can be dangerous things." Above the water, the sky darkened slightly, a soft gray that looked almost metallic. Ethan joined in, voice too practiced. "Mom, you've carried the company long enough. Dad would have wanted you to enjoy life now. Robert wanted integrity." I said, my tone sharper than I meant. The way Ethan's jaw tightened told me the conversation had turned. Vanessa reached for his hand, her smile never breaking. "He just means you deserve peace. We'll make sure everything is secure. You don't have to worry." "Worry is the reason I still have a fortune," I said quietly. For a moment, silence fell, only the sound of the engine cutting through water. Then Vanessa laughed again, light and hollow. "Oh, Eleanor, always the cautious queen." I looked out at the horizon, the gray, turning deeper. Something inside me snapped from denial to understanding. They weren't just trying to control my money, they were preparing a world without me. I excused myself and went below deck. In the mirror above the sink, my face looked calm, but my eyes, Robert used to say, they could scare bankers into truth, burned. I slipped my hand into the pill case, checked the recorder's red light. Still blinking. Proof. Back on deck, the wind picked up. Vanessa poured more champagne, hair whipping across her face. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass. Ethan followed suit. To family. I lifted my own glass steady, smiling like a woman who hadn't just heard her death sentence. To the ocean, I said. It has a way of showing who we really are. We drank. Salt air brushed against my lips. I saw her glance at Ethan, the faintest flick of communication passing between them. A plan rehearsed. When Vanessa turned away to adjust her shawl, I pulled the small transmitter from my purse and pressed the button twice. A faint click confirmed connection. Miles away in a gray building near downtown Seattle, Agent Marcus Hale received the signal. He looked at the glowing dot on his screen and said to his team, "We have contact." I turned back to Vanessa, pretending to admire the sunset. "How far are we from land?" "About 20 miles, she answered casually. "Why?" "Just wondering how deep the water gets out here." She laughed again, a sound that no longer fooled me. "Deep enough to drown secrets." I smiled almost warmly. "Then it's a good thing I don't keep any." She didn't notice the way my hand brushed the edge of the recorder, or the way I angled my purse so the tiny camera inside pointed directly at her. I'd spent my life mastering patience. Tonight it would save me. Ethan came to stand beside me. His voice softened as if he were 13 again, asking for forgiveness after breaking a window. "Mom, you trust me, right?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I used to." He blinked, taken aback. Before he could speak, Vanessa interrupted, tone syrupy and false. "Dinner's ready downstairs. Let's eat before the waves get rough." I nodded politely, following them to the stairs. My heels clicked against the teak wood, steady and calm. Inside, every nerve in my body was electric. I remembered what Robert once told me during our first business collapse: if someone wants to see you drown, learn how to breathe underwater. I took a slow breath, forcing my heart to steady. The table below deck was perfectly set, white linen, crystal glasses, candles flickering. Vanessa handed me a plate. "You're our guest of honor tonight." I sat, adjusting my scarf. "I'm always honored to dine with family." Ethan smiled nervously. "After dinner, maybe we can talk about restructuring the trust." "Of course," I said lightly. "But I think you'll find the structure's already changing." Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" I tapped the recorder in my purse, feeling the faint vibration of its active line. "Nothing important. Just tides turning." Outside, the first gull screamed, echoing across the bay. The yacht's light flickered briefly, as if the sea itself held its breath. Vanessa raised her glass again, voice smooth. "To a night we'll never forget." I met her gaze, smiling as I clinked my glass against hers. "Oh, I'm counting on that." They thought the ocean would take me. They didn't know I'd already invited the FBI. The next morning, the sky over Seattle was pale and wet, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones. I stood at the window of the Grant estate, the mansion that had once been my pride, watching the drizzle slip down the glass like ghosts. Every inch of this place carried Robert's memory: his study with the dark mahogany desk, the garden we planted together, but none of it felt like mine anymore. I had built this house on loyalty and love. They had rebuilt it on ambition and control. When I stepped into the marble hallway, I could almost hear his voice in my head. "Eleanor, never give your power away, not even to the people you love." I had laughed at him then. Love wasn't power, I thought it was trust. But standing there now, in a house that felt like a museum of my mistakes, I finally understood what he meant. The morning paper was folded neatly on the counter, but I didn't bother opening it. Lydia, my housekeeper and oldest friend, was waiting near the dining table holding a cup of coffee. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. "Would you?" I replied, my voice dry. She hesitated. "Do you think Ethan knows that I heard everything?" I smiled faintly. "No. And we'll keep it that way." For a moment, silence stretched between us, filled with the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Lydia set down the coffee, her eyes darting toward the closed office door at the end of the hall. "He's in there now," she whispered. Been on the phone all morning. Sounded angry. I nodded slowly. Then it's time I remind him whose name is still on the deed. When I entered the office, Ethan was pacing phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I'm aware, he snapped. Just file the papers, she won't fight it. He froze when he saw me. Mom, you're up early. I'm old, not dead, I said, taking a seat across from his desk. Who were you talking to? He hesitated a moment too long. Just the bank. Updating some of the trust accounts. I see. My eyes fell on the documents scattered across the desk pages, with my name printed in bold at the top. The Grant Family Trust. My chest tightened. You know, I said lightly, your father used to tell me never to sign anything before breakfast. He forced a laugh. Good advice. I leaned forward, my tone even. Ethan, I'd like to review the accounts myself. He blinked, clearly unprepared for resistance. Mom, you shouldn't stress about this. Vanessa and I. Vanessa is not a Grant by blood, I cut in, and this estate isn't a game of Monopoly. His jaw tensed. You think I'd let anything happen to what you and Dad built? I stared at him, seeing not my son but a stranger in a tailored suit. I think you already have. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. You've changed since the surgery. You're paranoid. I almost laughed. No, darling, I'm awake. He said nothing more, but I could feel the anger radiating from him as I left. Lydia met me in the hallway, her face pale. He didn't deny it, he didn't need to. I spent the next hours in Robert's old study, the one room Ethan never entered. Dust coated the bookshelves and the faint scent of his cigar still lingered. I opened the locked drawer under his desk and pulled out the last box he'd left me: keys, ledgers, and a faded leather folder labeled Pacific Crest Holdings. I hadn't looked at it in years. Inside were stock certificates, property titles, and one yellowed note in Robert's handwriting. If something ever feels wrong, start with the numbers. So I did. The ledgers were neat, but off transfers that didn't match the dates. I remembered amounts too exact to be coincidence. I scribbled them down, cross-checking with my current account statements. When I added them up, nearly $85 million were missing, moved into a new holding company named Vanguard Initiative. The signatures at the bottom were Ethan's and Vanessa's. A bitter laugh escaped me. They didn't even bother to hide it under fake names. Lydia, who had been quietly dusting the shelves, turned. What did you find? Proof of stupidity, I said. And greed. By late afternoon the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and shining. I decided to visit my attorney, someone Robert had trusted for decades. But when I called, the secretary answered with an unfamiliar tone. I'm sorry, Mrs. Grant, but Mr. Hollis retired 2 months ago. All of your files have been transferred to your son's representative. Representative, I repeated. Yes, ma'am. Miss Vanessa Grant. The line went dead before I could speak. I sat there gripping the phone until my fingers ached. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was erasure. They'd taken my lawyer, my accountant, my access to my own company. Bit by bit, they were making me a ghost before I was even dead. That evening Vanessa arrived at the mansion, all perfume and charm, as if the previous night had never happened. Ethan told me you've been worrying about the finances, she said, stepping into the living room with a box of pastries. You should relax, Mom. Stress isn't good for recovery. I smiled thinly. Neither is treachery. Her laugh was airy, but her eyes flickered. Always the dramatic one. I brought something to cheer you up, a proposal. A simplified trust that will make everything smoother in case, well, something happens. She pulled out a folder, sleek and white, and slid it across the table. I opened it slowly. Power of attorney. Durable, irrevocable. Every line screamed control. You'd just sign here, she said sweetly. It's purely procedural. Ethan and I can handle the paperwork so you can focus on your health. I tapped my finger on the signature line. And what happens if I forget my name, Vanessa? Her smile sharpened. That's why this is important. I closed the folder. No. She blinked, feigning confusion. No, I said no. I may be old, but I still know when a snake's offering me apples. Her expression cracked for a split second before smoothing over. You're making a mistake. Maybe, I said, standing. But it'll be my mistake, not yours. She watched me for a long moment, then gathered her things with an icy grace. I'll tell Ethan, you're tired. When she left, I locked the door behind her and leaned against it, my pulse racing. The mask had slipped, and underneath the charm I'd seen the truth: ambition without limits. Lydia found me in Robert's study later that night, sitting among the ledgers and papers. "You can't fight them alone," she whispered. I looked up at her, my face calm, but my voice steady. "Who said I'm alone?" she frowned. "Do you mean—" "Yes," I said quietly. "The Bureau already has my signal. Marcus Hale is watching," she gasped. "You trust the FBI, I trust results." I picked up the small recorder from the night before and rewound it. The sound of Vanessa's whisper filled the room. "Tonight, we push her off the yacht." Ethan's voice followed, hesitant, trembling. "You're sure she'll fall?" Lydia shivered. "It's awful hearing it again." I pressed stop, sliding the device into an envelope. "Awful, yes. But necessary." The grandfather clock struck 9, echoing through the house. I looked around the room, at Robert's books, at the faded photograph of our wedding day, at the legacy we'd built from nothing. I realized then that grief had made me too kind, too forgiving. I poured a small glass of wine, lifted it toward the picture and murmured, "You were right, Robert. I gave my power away. But I'm taking it back." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the garden. The roses we'd planted decades ago, bent but didn't break. I stood by the window watching the storm gather in the distance and whispered, "If they want a war, I'll give them one." The phone rang once, twice. Lydia answered, handed it to me with trembling fingers. "It's Ethan." His voice came through, calm and careful. "Mom, Vanessa and I were thinking, maybe another yacht trip this weekend. The sea might help you clear your mind." I smiled, my tone soft as silk. "Of course, darling, the sea always does." When the call ended, I turned to Lydia. "Get me Robert's old safe box from the cellar. And call Marcus. Tell him we're setting a trap." Lydia's eyes widened. "A trap?" "Yes," I said, watching the lightning flash across the horizon. "They think I'm scared of drowning. They've forgotten who taught them how to swim." By dawn, I was wide awake, watching the fog slide off, the sound like a curtain being drawn. The city below was still asleep, but my mind wasn't. Somewhere out there, Ethan and Vanessa were planning their next move, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I'd spent too long reacting. Now it was my turn to act. Marcus Hale called at 7. His voice was rough, steady, like gravel on pavement. "We got your package, Mrs. Grant. The recording's clean, clear enough to make a case if we connect it to the financial trail." "What do you need from me?" I asked, stirring my coffee, though it had already gone cold. "Paperwork," he said. "Proof that the funds they're trying to seize belong solely to you. We can trace transactions through offshore accounts if we get authorization." "You'll have it by noon," I replied. He paused. "And Mrs. Grant, don't meet them alone. Let them believe you're compliant. If they try again, we'll be there." I smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Agent Hale, I don't plan on dying twice." After the call, Lydia brought me the safe box. Inside were the remnants of a life Robert and I had built: our marriage certificate, old hotel deeds, trust papers signed before the cancer took him. My fingers brushed the embossed gold letters of Pacific Crest Hotels and Holdings, the company we'd started in a single building and turned into an empire. Every property, every account, still bore my name. That was the anchor they couldn't cut. By noon, Marcus had 2 men from the Bureau at my door pretending to be insurance adjusters. They installed discreet cameras in the foyer and office, hidden inside the chandelier and clock. Lydia kept glancing nervously at them, whispering, "Are we safe?" "As long as I'm alive," I said. "They're the ones who should be nervous." In the afternoon, a delivery arrived, a bouquet of white lilies. The card read, "Thinking of you. V." The handwriting was smooth, elegant, and full of venom. I let the flowers sit untouched in the foyer until dusk, when their scent grew cloying and sweet. That evening, Ethan called again. "Mom," he said in his best gentle voice, "Vanessa was upset after your argument. She feels like you don't trust us." "I don't," I said flatly. He sighed. "Mom, please. You're not well." "I've spoken to Dr. Fulton," he said. "Post-surgery confusion can cause paranoia. Vanessa's only trying to help." I almost laughed. "Did the doctor also suggest pushing your mother off a yacht?" He went silent. Then after a beat, "That's not funny. I wasn't joking. He hung up without another word. Lydia stared at me after I set the phone down. You're provoking them. I'm reminding them, I said quietly, that I'm still here. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, notebook open, writing every detail of their behavior over the last few months, their visits, their comments, the missing calls from my accountant, the suspicious transfers. The pattern was clear now: psychological isolation first, then legal manipulation, and finally, a staged accident. It wasn't just greed, it was strategy. By morning, the sun broke through pale gold on wet glass. I took a long shower, dressed in gray slacks and a white blouse, and drove to downtown Seattle. My destination was Kane Financial Advisors, the firm that had handled my portfolio for 2 decades. The receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment? Tell Edward Kane that Eleanor Grant is here," I said. Her expression shifted slightly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grant. Mr. Kane isn't available. He's traveling for business." I leaned closer. "Then tell his assistant to print my account statements for the past 6 months. I'll wait." She hesitated, then disappeared into the back. 10 minutes later, a young man in a navy suit appeared holding a folder. "Mrs. Grant, I'm afraid your accounts have been consolidated under your son's authorization. You'll have to speak with him directly." I took the folder from him anyway, flipping through the pages. There it was again: Vanguard Initiative, the same name I'd seen on Robert's old ledgers. "Who authorized this consolidation?" I asked. He swallowed. "Miss Vanessa Grant signed as your legal proxy." I closed the folder calmly. "Thank you," I said. "You've been very helpful." By the time I reached my car, Marcus was already calling. "You were right," I told him. "They've already moved the funds. We'll need to track Vanguard. Send me copies," he said. "We'll trace every penny." I sent him the scanned pages from my phone, then sat back and stared at the street. Across from me in a cafe window, I caught a reflection, a woman watching me, wearing dark glasses and a beige coat. When I turned to look directly, she turned away. I didn't see her face, but something in her posture made my pulse jump. By the time I got home, a black SUV was parked across the street, engine idling. Lydia noticed it too. "That's been there since morning," she whispered. "Let them watch," I said. "It saves me from hiring guards." At dusk, the phone rang again. Vanessa's voice was honeyed and cool. "Mom, I'm sorry about yesterday. I shouldn't have pressured you." I leaned back, letting her speak. "I thought maybe we could start over," she continued. "Ethan and I want to take you somewhere peaceful up the coast, maybe Bainbridge Island. You loved it there, remember? We could talk about the future." "The future," I repeated softly. "Yes," she said brightly. "And it's time we settle everything. You'll feel better once it's all handled." Handled. The word tasted like poison. "I'll think about it," I said. "When are you leaving Friday? We'll pick you up at noon." When she hung up, Lydia whispered, "You're not going, are you?" "Oh, I'm going," I said, turning to the window where the black SUV still waited, just not the way they expect. That night, Marcus came in person. He wore plain clothes, looked more like a fisherman than an agent. He set a briefcase on my kitchen table and opened it, a small transmitter, a body mic, and a GPS beacon disguised as a pendant. "You'll wear this," he said. "If they try anything, we'll have audio and location in real time. And if they throw me overboard, then we'll be there before you hit the water." I smiled faintly. "I'll hold you to that." Before he left, he paused at the door. "You know, most people your age would have run. You're walking into their trap." "I'm not walking," I said. "I'm leading." The next 2 days were quiet, too quiet. Ethan didn't call. Vanessa didn't visit. The only sounds were the creaks of the old house and the faint hum of the hidden surveillance gear. Lydia tried to hide her worry, but I could see it in her eyes every time she refilled my tea. Thursday night, the rain returned heavy and relentless. I packed a small bag, my will, Robert's ring, and the pendant Marcus had given me. Then I stood in the doorway of my study, looking back at the life I'd built, the photographs, the paintings, the echoes of decades of work. When the lightning flashed, it caught my reflection in the glass, older, thinner, but steady. "They think they're chasing my money," I whispered. "But what I'm giving them is a confession." I turned off the lights, left the house to the hum of the storm, and stepped into the waiting car outside. The Bureau's vehicle followed a mile behind, headlights off. As we drove toward the marina, the sea opened ahead like a mouth, waiting to swallow everything false. In my lap, the pendant blinked once, a small red pulse. Marcus's voice came through the tiny earpiece. "We're with you, Eleanor. Let them play their part." I closed my eyes, letting the motion of the car steady my breath. "Don't worry," I murmured. "The play's already written." Somewhere beyond the rain, the ocean waited. And this time, I wasn't the one who'd drown. The day of the trip dawned bright and unnervingly calm, the kind of morning sailors call a liar's sky, too quiet, too clear before a storm. I dressed in my navy coat and pinned the small pendant Marcus had given me beneath the scarf Robert once wore to every board meeting. Lydia stood in the doorway as I gathered my things. "You don't have to go," she whispered. "I do," I said. "If I run, they win." She pressed a folded paper into my hand. "It's a prayer my mother used to say when she was scared, just in case." I smiled, slipping it into my pocket. "I'm not scared, Lydia. I'm ready." By noon, a black sedan pulled up the circular drive. Ethan stepped out, his smile rehearsed, his eyes tired. "You look wonderful, Mom. I'm glad you agreed to come." Vanessa followed, dressed in cream linen and pearls, the picture of elegance. "Perfect day for the sea," she said lightly. "Yes," I answered, locking the front door behind me. "A perfect day for truth." They didn't notice the brief flash of a camera lens from the unmarked car parked 2 houses down. Marcus and his team were already in place. The drive to the marina was a silent performance. Ethan kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, trying to measure something in my face. Vanessa scrolled on her phone, smiling occasionally at whatever message she was sending. My fingers rested on the pendant, feeling its tiny heartbeat of light. The silver swan gleamed under the sunlight, the same pristine white hull that had once made me proud. I ran my hand along the rail as I boarded, hiding the shiver that crawled up my spine. The deck crew, all strangers, greeted us politely before disappearing below. Vanessa poured champagne, her movements smooth as choreography. "To new beginnings," she said again. I raised my glass. "To endings that teach us." The yacht pulled away, cutting a path through the bright blue water. Seattle shrank behind us, swallowed by distance. The air smelled of salt and betrayal. Ethan joined me near the bow, his voice low. "Mom, I know things have been tense. Vanessa gets carried away sometimes, but she wants what's best for you. We both do." "What's best for me?" I said, "or what's left for you?" He looked hurt but not surprised. "You've always thought I couldn't handle the business. I was trying to prove I could. By stealing it," he clenched his jaw. "By protecting it. You've been sick. We didn't know how much time we had." I turned to face him fully. "You had enough time to fake my incompetence. Enough time to forge signatures. Enough time to plan a death." He blinked hard, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I didn't," Vanessa said. "I know what Vanessa said," I cut in. "She talks, you obey, same as always." Before he could answer, she appeared behind us, voice light as silk. "We're about an hour out. The sea's perfect today." "Yes," I said quietly. "Almost peaceful." We moved back toward the cabin. Vanessa gestured toward a bottle of wine resting on the counter. "Mom, you must try this. It's from the vineyard Robert used to love." "I'll pour it myself," I said. She laughed too quickly. "Of course. I didn't mean." I lifted the cork, sniffed. The faint smell of bitterness beneath the grapes confirmed what I already suspected. "You know," I said, pouring the wine slowly, "Robert once told me that people reveal their true selves in the way they pour a drink." Vanessa tilted her head. "And what do you see now?" I met her eyes. A woman about to spill everything. The wind rose. Waves began to lift the yacht gently, as if the sea were testing its balance. I took a small sip, then set the glass down untouched. Vanessa smiled, a thin line of control. "Ethan, maybe show your mother the new guest cabin. We had it redesigned." He hesitated. "Mom, come on. You'll love it." I followed, my heart steady. The hallway leading below deck smelled faintly of engine oil and salt. I could hear their footsteps behind me, the rhythm of a plan coming to life. The cabin was small, beautifully decorated, and if I hadn't known better, perfect for an accident. The balcony door opened directly onto the rail. Beyond it, nothing but endless blue. Ethan gestured. "See, we thought you'd enjoy the view." "I do," I said softly, walking toward the edge. I turned just as Vanessa stepped behind me, her hand tightening slightly around the railing. You chose a beautiful spot, I continued. Almost poetic. What do you mean? She asked, voice too smooth. I smiled. For a confession. Her face stiffened. Excuse me, I touched the pendant beneath my scarf, activating the mic. Marcus's voice murmured faintly in my ear, signals clear. Keep her talking. I looked straight at Vanessa. Tell me, how much did Bianca pay you for this? Her eyes flashed. Who? The lawyer who handled the transfers. Bianca Morales. She's the one pulling your strings, isn't she? She recovered quickly, laughing too loud. You've really lost it, Eleanor. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Does she know you used a poison drink instead of a push? Or was that your idea? Ethan's face went pale. Vanessa, what is she talking about? Nothing, Vanessa snapped. She's confused. She doesn't. The boat lurched sharply, a sudden swell lifting the deck. My hand gripped the doorframe, and in that instant the microphone caught her whisper. Just do it, Ethan. Now. His hand rose trembling. But before he could move, the sound of a helicopter filled the air. The yacht crew shouted above deck, startled. Vanessa's head snapped upward. What the hell? Marcus's voice came through my earpiece. FBI vessel inbound. Stay put. I straightened, calm. Looks like our guests have arrived early. Vanessa's face drained of color. What did you do? I listened, I said simply. And I prepared. Ethan backed away, shaking. You set us up? No, Ethan, I said softly. You set yourself up. I just made sure someone was watching. The helicopter hovered above, wind and noise swallowing her screams as agents rappelled down. One of them burst through the cabin door, weapon drawn. Hands where we can see them. Vanessa froze her hands, still clutching the rail. Ethan's knees gave out as two agents grabbed him. I stood silent, the wind whipping through my hair, the pendant still glowing faintly. Marcus stepped onto the deck a minute later, his coat flapping in the gusts. He gave me a small nod. You all right, Mrs. Grant? Better than expected, I said. They were about to make me the C's next donation. He looked at Vanessa, who stared back with venom. We'll take it from here, he said. I shook my head. No, not yet. She's not the mastermind. She's the face. The money trail leads beyond her. Vanessa hissed. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, meeting her gaze. But not as much as you. Marcus led them away, the agents cuffing their hands, reading rites that sounded almost ceremonial over the crashing waves. I stayed by the railing, watching the water churn beneath us. When the helicopter lifted off, taking them toward the coast, the sea calmed again. I exhaled, realizing for the first time in months that I was truly breathing. Marcus came to stand beside me. You could have told me you were planning to bait them this hard. I smiled faintly. Would you have let me? He considered. Probably not. I thought so. He looked out at the horizon. You know this isn't over. Someone paid them to do this. The way their accounts moved, it's part of a network. I figured, I said. And I intend to find out who. The boat rocked gently, sunlight breaking through the clouds. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then Marcus said quietly, What will you do now? I turned toward the horizon where the gray met the light. The same thing I've always done, I said. Build something from ruins. He nodded slowly. We'll keep the Bureau's protection on you until we're sure you're clear. Good, I said. Because the woman who planned this won't stop here. Marcus looked at me curiously. You think Bianca Morales is still watching? I smiled, the kind that comes from knowing the storm isn't over. I don't think Agent Hale. I know. The yacht drifted toward shore as the afternoon sun cut across the water, gilding the waves in gold. I stood there until the noise of the helicopter faded, the pendant's red light finally dimming against my chest. Somewhere behind the horizon, the next war was already waiting. The news broke before sunset. Every major channel ran the same headline: Billionaire hotel founder survives yacht murder plot, son and daughter-in-law in FBI custody. Cameras swarmed the docks as agents escorted Ethan and Vanessa off the Silver Swan, their faces ghost pale against the flashing lights. From my seat inside the Bureau van, I watched through the tinted window as the crowd roared with questions I didn't care to answer. Marcus sat across from me, his tablet glowing with a web of names and numbers. They'll keep this quiet for a few days, he said. But once the press gets wind of who's behind it, it'll blow open. And who is behind it? I asked, though I already suspected. He turned the screen toward me. A photo appeared, dark hair, steel gray eyes, a face as cold as a polished blade. Bianca Morales, senior partner at Morales & Kent LLP. Vanessa's lawyer, I said. And the architect of their financial setup, Marcus replied. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature goes through her firm. She's the one who made it all look legal. I studied the photo, tracing the edge of her confident smile. Women like her always think the law bends for them. Marcus leaned back. You know her? Not personally, I said. But I've met her kind all my life. People who think morality is optional if the paperwork is perfect. The van stopped outside a safe house on Bainbridge Island, a quiet wooden house surrounded by pine trees and fog. Lydia was already there when I arrived, her eyes red from crying. She grabbed my hands the moment I stepped inside. Thank God you're alive. Alive and tired, I said softly. She looked toward Marcus. Will they keep her safe? Marcus nodded. No one knows she's here except my team. Officially, you're still dead. That gives us an advantage. I sank into the armchair near the fireplace, the weight of the day pressing down on me. The fire crackled softly, throwing light across the room. For the first time in months, I felt warm. But peace never lasts long in my life. By the next morning, the media frenzy had turned savage. Reporters hounded every Grant property, spinning tales of family greed, mental decline, and secret inheritances. One anchorwoman's voice played on the TV in the kitchen. Sources claim Eleanor Grant suffered from post-surgery cognitive issues and may have misinterpreted her son's intentions. I turned off the screen before the bile could rise in my throat. They're rewriting my mind now, I said to Marcus, who was setting up files across the table. They're using the same playbook, he said grimly. Discredit, delay, destroy. But this time we're ready. He opened a file marked Project Tidefall Phase 2. Inside were photos, documents, transaction maps. Every trail leads back to Morales. She's more than a lawyer, she's the broker of power. Wealthy families hire her to manage transitions. Translation: she kills the paperwork first, then lets nature or accidents take care of the rest. I looked through the pages, recognizing names: widows, retirees, philanthropists, all elderly, all wealthy, all declared incompetent before they died. He nodded. 15 confirmed victims. Maybe more. I exhaled slowly, closing the file. So this wasn't just my family's greed. It's an industry. Exactly, Marcus said. Morales runs it through shell companies like Vanguard and Horizon. She's careful, no direct link to any violence. But the financial trail's there. I leaned forward. Then we follow it. That afternoon, while Marcus and his team traced digital accounts, I began writing down the names of everyone connected to my life who'd vanished in the past 2 years. My attorney, my accountant, even my longtime physician, all suddenly retired, transferred, or unreachable. They were isolating you, Marcus said when he saw the list. Cutting you off from anyone who'd protect you legally. They underestimated one thing, I replied. I don't need protectors. I need proof. We spent the next 2 days building it. Marcus's tech specialist, a young woman named Ava, dug through encrypted archives from Morales and Kent. You were right, she said, pointing to the screen. Here's a draft file labeled Transition, e.g. Grant Holdings. It's dated 2 weeks before your surgery. The document described a scenario nearly identical to what happened, subject to undergo medical procedure, cognitive risk assessed. Recommend accelerated estate restructuring in case of complication. In the corner of the page were 2 initials, B. M. Bianca Morales, Marcus said. I stared at the page, a mix of fury and grim satisfaction burning through me. They had my death on paper before they ever planned the yacht. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the pines outside, and the house creaked like it remembered too much. I sat by the window looking at the reflection of the fire behind me. In it I saw my younger self, ambitious, fearless, alive. The woman I'd buried beneath motherhood and mourning. Robert's voice echoed in memory. The ocean doesn't kill you, Eleanor. Fear does. I whispered to the dark. Then fear dies tonight. The next morning Marcus came in holding his phone. We found her. Morales, he nodded. Boston. She's hosting a legal symposium on wealth transition at the Seaport Hotel. Irony at its finest. Ava handed me a folder. We have her flight records. She's flying private tomorrow morning. We can intercept her contacts here before she leaves. I flipped through the pages, noting the pattern of her travel: New York, Palm Beach, Zurich. She's collecting signatures, I murmured. Meeting the next targets. Marcus studied me. You're thinking of confronting her. I'm thinking of inviting her, I said. He frowned. That's risky. So is dying on a yacht, Agent Hale. By evening, the plan was set. Ava created a secure email from a dummy firm using Vanessa's old signature inviting Bianca to a final client settlement meeting regarding the Grant inheritance. We chose a neutral location, a private lounge in downtown Seattle. I would be there. As the sun sank behind the sound, Lydia brought me a cup of tea. You should rest, she said gently. I will, I promised. After tomorrow. She hesitated. You're not the same woman who left this house months ago. No, I said softly. That woman died in the bay. The one standing here is what came back. The next morning I dressed in black, simple, sharp, unyielding. Marcus wired me again, his expression grim. You sure you're ready for this? I've been ready since the moment she signed my death certificate, I said. When we arrived at the meeting site, the air was heavy with rain. The lounge was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of place where secrets like to breathe. I sat at the center table, the recorder on my pulse steady. At exactly 9, Bianca Morales walked in. Everything about her screamed precision-tailored suit, perfect hair, eyes that measured and dismissed in the same glance. She smiled like a cat. Mrs. Grant. I must say, resurrection suits you. I met her gaze without blinking. I came to thank you. Her brow arched. For what? For reminding me that the dead can still fight back. She laughed softly, setting her briefcase on the table. Let's talk business, shall we? And as she began to open the file in front of her, I knew the real storm was only beginning. The first thing I noticed about Bianca Morales wasn't her confidence, it was the way she controlled silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it stretch between us like a wire waiting to see who would flinch first. I didn't. She opened her briefcase slowly, every movement precise. Inside were neatly bound folders marked with coded tabs. I must admit, she said, her voice smooth as marble, I didn't expect this meeting to happen. You've been quite the surprise. I've been called worse, I said. Usually by people who underestimate me. Her lips curved. You've survived quite an ordeal, Mrs. Grant. A tragic misunderstanding if you ask me. Your children clearly panicked. Children panic when they break a vase, I replied evenly. Not when they forge medical records and hire hitmen. Bianca leaned back, steepling her fingers. You have a vivid imagination. But I'm here to help set things right, perhaps even restore your public image. The media can be merciless to women our age. Merciless, yes, I said, leaning forward. But easily redirected. Marcus's voice came through faintly in my earpiece. Keep her talking, we're tracing her device. I smiled. You're good at playing both sides, Miss Morales. I can see why Vanessa trusted you. Trust is a strong word, she replied. Vanessa was useful. Pretty ambitious, not particularly bright. Ethan, on the other hand, had a certain loyalty. Until fear got in the way. Her tone was casual, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the tiny twitch of pride that came from saying more than she should have. I decided to push. So it was your plan then? The yacht, the documents, the transfer. She tilted her head slightly. You make it sound so sinister. All I did was prepare contingency files. If an elderly client suffered a fatal accident, their assets would transition smoothly. The law requires clarity, Mrs. Grant. I simply provide it. By making accidents happen, her smile froze for a heartbeat. Then it returned sharper. You can't prove that. Maybe not yet, I said, but I will. For the first time, her composure cracked. You think your little FBI friends scare me. I've buried more cases than you've lived years. Then, you should have buried this one deeper, I said quietly. Because I'm not dead, and I don't stay silent. She stood gathering her files. I'll pretend this conversation never happened. You should do the same. Walk away if you like, I said. But just so you know, the Bureau already has your call logs with Vanessa and Ethan. Every offshore account, every trust signature, every name you used to erase people like me. That stopped her. You're bluffing. Marcus's voice came through softly, timed perfectly. Data confirmed. Transmission complete. I met her gaze. No, Miss Morales. I'm winning. Her expression changed, not fear, not anger, but something colder. Calculation. You think you've won because you got me on tape. You don't understand how deep this goes. You're just one file in a vault full of them. That was the moment I realized she wasn't lying. There were others, dozens, maybe hundreds, each with a name, a will, a planned transition. I stayed calm. Then I'll burn the vault. Bianca smiled thinly, gathering her things. I look forward to watching you try. She turned and left, heels clicking across the marble floor, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume and rot behind her. The door closed. Marcus entered seconds later, pulling out his earpiece. We got everything, he said. Her GPS audio, even the encrypted call she made before walking in. To who, I asked. He hesitated. We don't know yet. But she said one name, Project Pacific. I frowned. Pacific? Yes, he said. It came up twice in the metadata of her emails. It's not a firm, it's an operation. I sank back into the chair. She used the name of my company as a front. That's how she laundered the assets. Marcus nodded grimly. We're pulling financial records now. But there's more. The Bureau believes she's part of a ring, lawyers, doctors, and financial advisors, all tied to sudden deaths of wealthy seniors. I looked at him steadily. Then she's not just my problem, she's a system. Exactly, he said, and we need to know how to break it. Later that night we returned to the safe house. Lydia had prepared tea, her hands trembling slightly. Did she believe you? She believed she's untouchable, I said. That's always their mistake. I spent the evening reading through old files, contracts. Robert and I had signed decades ago, agreements that now felt like ghosts of our past life. Each page reminded me how fragile control really was. Marcus sat opposite me, working on his laptop. We found 2 offshore firms connected to Morales, he said. Horizon Assets and Mercer and Hale Advisory. I looked up. Mercer and Hale. That name sounds familiar. It should, he said. They handled the estate of Robert Grant after his passing. The words hit like ice. She's been circling me for years, I whispered. Marcus nodded. She used your husband's death as the template. Your case was just the largest payout she ever planned. The fire crackled in the corner, throwing light on the walls. Outside, wind howled across the sound, but inside, I felt a strange, still calm. You know what the worst part is, I said. I used to sign thank you notes to these people. I thought they were protecting my legacy. Marcus looked up. They underestimated the wrong widow. I smiled faintly. They always do. Before midnight, Ava called from the bureau. We've decrypted part of Bianca's drive. There's a list, names, dates, codes. We think it's a record of all her transitions. Marcus put her on speaker. How many names? 39, she said. All marked resolved. My breath caught. Resolved, I repeated. Like they were problems. Ava hesitated. There's more. The last name on the list, yours. Marcus glanced at me. That confirms it, I nodded slowly. Then we finish this. If there are 38 others, we find every one of them. He leaned forward. You're sure? Yes, I said. Because this stopped being about money a long time ago. The next morning I stood on the porch watching fog roll off the sea. The air tasted clean, sharper than before. Lydia joined me with her shawl wrapped tight. What now? She asked. Now, I said, we wake the ghosts she buried. The plan unfolded over the next 48 hours. Marcus's team tracked the surviving families of Morales's victims, reaching out discreetly. Some didn't believe him. Others cried quietly when they realized their parents' deaths weren't natural. By the 3rd day, Ava found something new, an anonymous email in Bianca's archive. It was short, unsigned, and chilling. Phase 4 complete. Audit in 2 weeks. Transfer control to Pacific Central. MT. Who's MT? Marcus muttered. I stared at the screen. Whoever they are, they're above her. She's just management. He exhaled. Then, we climb higher. That night, as the team left to regroup, I stayed by the window again, the sea glimmering faintly under moonlight. I thought of Robert, of Ethan, of every life twisted by greed disguised as care. I whispered to the waves, they wanted to write my ending. But they forgot, authors don't die in their own stories. Somewhere out there, Bianca Morales was already planning her next move. But so was I. And this time, I wasn't the prey. I was the storm coming back to shore. The news of my death spread faster the second time around. Every major outlet ran the same headline: Eleanor Grant, 73, confirmed dead after FBI standoff. They showed grainy photos of my yacht, an old portrait from a charity gala, and clips of Ethan and Vanessa in handcuffs, crying on cue. The world believed the show because it was exactly what Bianca Morales wanted them to see. Marcus set the tablet down on the table. "It worked," he said. "She's bought it. Her legal team filed a motion this morning to close your estate permanently. That means she's moving money." I stirred my tea slowly, watching steam rise like ghosts. Good. Let her think. I've finally stopped breathing. We were in a safe house tucked behind a row of weathered pine trees on Whidbey Island, a place where the air smelled like salt and moss. Lydia moved quietly between the stove and the window, keeping her voice low. "It feels wrong pretending you're gone." I looked at her and smiled. Wrong would be letting them win. Marcus's phone buzzed. He read the message, then handed it to me. "Target moving funds through Mercer and Hale. New account code Pacific 27. "Pacific again," I said. "Always Pacific," he muttered. "She's funneling every stolen estate into that network. We just don't know where it ends." I leaned back, letting the sound of the sea fill the silence. "Then we start where all money hides, behind paper and fear." That night the island wind beat against the windows, rattling the old frames. I couldn't sleep. The world thought I was a ghost, and maybe in a way I was. The woman who cared about public image board meetings, appearances, she'd died the night Vanessa whispered on that yacht. What was left was something colder, sharper, alive only for one reason. By morning, Marcus was already working, coffee in one hand, laptop glowing in the other. "We've traced a portion of the funds to Zurich," he said. "Bianca's partner there is Edward Kane. He's the numbers man, the one who keeps the books invisible." "Robert used to mention him," I said softly. "He handled part of our hotel expansion." I thought he was honest. Marcus glanced up. He was. Until Morales bought him. Ava joined us on a secure call, her voice tinny through the speaker. "We intercepted a message from Kane's office. He's meeting Morales tonight at a law conference in Boston. There's a record of a private dinner reservation table for two, under the name Project Pacific Advisory." Marcus looked at me. "We can monitor, but we need someone she won't suspect to be in the room." I smiled faintly. "Then it's fortunate she thinks I'm dead." Lydia dropped the dish towel. "Eleanor, no. You can't just walk into her den." "Why not?" I said. "Ghosts go where the living can't." Marcus rubbed his temples. "You really don't make this easy for me. Would you have followed me if I did?" I asked. He sighed. "I'll set it up." By evening, the plan was in motion. Marcus arranged a meeting at the Seaport Hotel under an alias Marjorie Whitfield, a wealthy widow seeking Bianca's services. The bureau would listen from the next room, monitoring every word. When I arrived, the lobby shimmered with glass and marble, the kind of wealth that looks like absolution. Bianca sat near the bar, her reflection doubled in the mirror behind her. She was flawless as always, white suit, diamond earrings, expression carved from ice. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, rising. "Please sit. I hear you've had complications with your estate." I smiled, lowering my sunglasses. "Let's say I'm looking for a more permanent solution." She studied me, curiosity flickering in her eyes but not recognition. "You've come to the right place. I hear you specialize in discretion," I said, leaning forward. Bianca's lips curved. "Discretion is my business. My clients come to me when they want peace of mind. Or peace in general," she chuckled softly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Her phone vibrated. She glanced down, then quickly hid the screen. But I saw it. Pacific 27, approved. Marcus's voice crackled faintly in my ear. "We got it. Transfer confirmed. Keep her there." I lifted my glass of water. "You must be exhausted, Miss Morales. Managing so many estates, so many families." I can't imagine keeping track. She shrugged. Numbers are easier than people. That's funny, I said. Because I've been keeping track of people. 39 names, all clients of yours, all dead. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes went still. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying you've been killing for profit, I said, my voice calm. Or letting others do it, then cleaning the money through Pacific Holdings. She laughed quietly. You've been reading too many headlines, Mrs. Whitfield. Headlines can lie, I said. But recordings don't. Her smile faltered. I placed a small USB on the table between us. Vanessa's voice. Ethan's voice. And yours. I wonder what the Bureau would say if they heard this. Bianca's jaw tightened. Who are you? I removed my sunglasses. The woman you thought drowned. For a moment her composure cracked. Then she recovered, whispering, Impossible. Nothing's impossible, I said. Not survival, not revenge, not justice. Her gaze hardened. You've made a mistake showing yourself. You think the FBI can protect you. They work for the same people who fund me. I'm counting on that, I said. Because when a web catches light, every spider burns. Her phone buzzed again. She silenced it, but I caught a glimpse of the contact name, MT. I stood. Tell your friend MT the Pacific is closing. Every wave returns to shore eventually. She rose as well, her face pale under the chandelier. You don't understand what you've started. I understand perfectly, I said. You created a machine that feeds on the weak. I'm here to cut the power. Before she could answer, 2 FBI agents stepped from the elevator, moving fast. One placed a hand on her shoulder. Bianca Morales, you're under federal investigation. Please come with us. She turned toward me, fury and fear warring in her eyes. This isn't over, Mrs. Grant. I smiled. I know, it's just begun. Marcus appeared from the hall as the agents escorted her away. You couldn't resist the reveal, could you? She deserved to see the ghost, I said. He handed me a tablet. Before we grabbed her, she sent one last message to an unknown server in New York. The subject line was, Phase 4 Acceleration. Acceleration, I repeated. Meaning she had a contingency. Marcus nodded. Exactly. And we need to find it before it finds us. We left the hotel through a service exit, slipping into the night air. Rain fell in thin silver sheets, the city lights reflecting off every drop. As we drove away, I looked out at the harbor, remembering the cold weight of water, the silence, before I clawed my way back to the surface. Bianca Morales thought she could bury me, I murmured. She forgot that I learned to breathe underwater. Marcus glanced at me. You realize this only gets harder from here. I turned to him, calm and certain. Good. That means we're getting closer to the truth. Outside, thunder rolled over the bay, and somewhere beyond the rain, the Pacific waited, dark, endless, and ready for the reckoning that was coming. At 7 in the morning, the world woke up to a ghost. Every major news network streamed the same headline, a message from the late Eleanor Grant. The video had gone live while most of Seattle was still asleep. It showed me sitting in front of a window, sunlight behind my shoulders, my voice low and even. If you're watching this, I said on screen, it means someone decided I didn't deserve to live. But they were wrong. This isn't a farewell, it's evidence. I held up a silver flash drive, letting the light glint off its surface. Behind every peaceful death, there's a signature and a smile. Their names are coming next. Within 3 hours, the video had over 10 million views. Hashtags flooded social media: number Justice for Eleanor, number Ghost of the Bay, number Grant Revenge. Morning anchors called it the most shocking twist in corporate history. In the penthouse downtown, Vanessa hurled her coffee cup at the TV. She's dead. She's supposed to be dead. Ethan stood by the window, pale voice shaking. Then why is she talking? Because she's a manipulative witch, Vanessa hissed. She planned this. She wants to destroy everything. He stared at the screen where my recorded voice continued. You can steal my name, but not my truth. She already did, he whispered. Across the sound, in the quiet safety of Whidbey Island, Marcus turned off the television and looked at me. You realize what you just did, right? You started a war. I sipped my coffee, calm. Wars don't start with guns anymore, Marcus. They start with information. He ran a hand through his hair. Morales will panic. Her entire business model depends on secrecy. She'll go underground, or worse. Good, I said. I need her out in the open. Lydia came in with a tray of toast, her expression worried. You've gone viral, Eleanor. Reporters are camping outside the old estate. They say the dead are suing the living. I smiled faintly. It's poetic, isn't it? Marcus scrolled through his phone, reading aloud the trending comments. One viewer says, "You're a symbol for every woman whose family tried to erase her." Another wants to nominate you for the Congressional Medal of Honor. Let them talk, I said. The more noise, the harder it is for Bianca to silence me. Outside, the rain began to fall again, fine and cold. I stood by the window, watching droplets streak down the glass like the trails of time itself. She used the law to kill, I murmured. Now the law will bring her down. Marcus nodded. Then let's start with what she fears most: public exposure. By noon, the FBI team had released a partial file from Bianca's encrypted drives, 3 cases, labeled Transition 1, 4, Transition 19, and Transition 2, 7. Each bore her digital signature, confirming her as executor. Beneath the text were photos of the deceased Harold Lynn drowned in his bathtub, Margaret O'Neill overdosed on prescription medication, and me, Eleanor Grant, listed as accidental maritime fatality. I stared at the screen, the image of my smiling face framed by the words "resolved estate." She wrote my obituary before the ocean did. Marcus's jaw tightened. We'll leak these selectively. Let the world see the pattern before we make the arrest. Not yet, I said. We need her to speak first. I want her voice confessing, not her silence denying. That night the city shimmered under a storm. Lights reflected on the bay red and gold, while news anchors dissected every angle of the case. The public loved a resurrection. But I wasn't here for spectacle. I was here for justice. Bianca Morales's law office was still operating, though her staff had dwindled. Inside her glass tower, she sat in a conference room, surrounded by files and fear. Her assistant, trembling, whispered, "Miss Morales, the bureau's online too. They're asking for your statement." Bianca's eyes flicked to the window where lightning fractured the skyline. "Tell them I have nothing to hide." "Should I schedule a press call?" "No," she said coldly. "They'll hear from me when I decide." Then her phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Morales," I said softly. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. "You," she whispered. "You sound surprised. You're not alive." "I'm many things you said I wasn't," I replied. "Alive is just one of them." "What do you want?" "The truth," I said, "the kind you can't delete." "You can't prove anything." "I don't have to." "You already did." I hung up before she could speak again. Marcus, monitoring from the safe house, grinned. "Perfect. We've got her voice and her IP. She's panicking." "Good," I said. "Panic makes people sloppy." 2 hours later, an anonymous tip landed on a journalist's desk at the Boston Ledger. Within minutes, headlines exploded. Attorney linked to elder abuse scheme under federal scrutiny. Networks replayed clips of me from the video, dissecting every word, every look. One female anchor, silver-haired and strong-voiced, looked directly into the camera and said, "This isn't just about one woman's revenge. It's about every woman who was told she's too old, too weak, or too confused to fight back." Lydia sat beside me, watching her hand over her heart. "She understands you. She understands herself," I said. The next morning Marcus burst into the room holding a tablet. Bianca took the bait. She called Edward Kane in Zurich. The bureau tapped the line. She told him to liquidate Project Pacific and transfer all funds to a dummy corporation before the feds freeze her accounts. I nodded. "And Kane will lead us straight to MT. "Whoever that is," Marcus said. "The name keeps showing up everywhere. Morales isn't top of the ladder, she's middle management." I stared at the map of transactions glowing on the screen, lines stretching from Boston to Zurich to Singapore, a web of greed connecting continents. "She built a system that profits off death," I said quietly. "Let's see how she handles resurrection." That afternoon I returned to the marina alone. The tide was low, the sky wide and gray. The water looked almost gentle, but I could still feel its chill in my bones. I tossed a single white rose into the bay, watching it drift away. "You couldn't drown me," I whispered. "You only taught me how to float." When I came back, Marcus was waiting with a new file. You'll want to see this. Inside were records from Bianca's personal trust. The beneficiary line was blank until Ava decrypted it. Then one name appeared, Bianca Morales. I smiled. So the queen crowned herself. Marcus nodded. She's her own heir. The entire Pacific operation was designed to funnel assets back to her. Then she's not a lawyer, I said. She's a thief in heels. That evening, as the sun bled out over the water, Lydia lit a fire in the hearth. I sat beside it, sipping tea, my thoughts quiet but fierce. Robert used to say, "Death gives people clarity," I murmured. Maybe that's why I had to die to see what I refused to before. Marcus looked at me. "What do you see now?" "Patterns," I said. "And power built on silence. But silence cracks when someone starts talking." He smiled faintly. "You just gave me an idea." An hour later he uploaded my full testimony to the Bureau's digital archive, public access, time-stamped immutable. No one could erase it. At the same time, an official subpoena went out for Bianca Morales, ordering her to appear before the federal grand jury. By the time the sun rose, her empire was already collapsing. I watched the headlines scroll across the screen. Lawyer behind inheritance fraud under investigation. Ghost widow brings down legal empire. Lydia placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over." "Not yet," I said, closing the laptop. "Bianca's clever. She'll run. But when she does, she'll lead us to MT. And then we'll finish what she started." Outside, the waves rolled in steady and sure. "They thought killing me would end the story," I whispered. "But they forgot, ghosts don't disappear, they haunt." Bianca Morales didn't show up for her subpoena. By dawn, her office was empty, files, shredded hard drives, wiped accounts, frozen just seconds too late. Cameras caught her black Mercedes crossing the border into Canada, before disappearing into a snowstorm. Marcus slammed the report down on the table. "She's gone. No flights, no credit cards, no phone pings. She's a ghost." I looked up from the cup of tea I hadn't touched. "Then it takes one ghost to find another." Lydia turned from the window, worry etched in her face. "Eleanor, you can't chase her yourself. Let the FBI handle it." "The FBI didn't see my son throw me into the sea," I said quietly. "The FBI didn't watch my name get erased one document at a time." "No, Lydia. This isn't theirs. This is mine." Marcus leaned on the table, lowering his voice. "You want her alive, right?" "I want her scared first," I said. He didn't argue. He knew the tone. It wasn't rage, it was certainty. The kind that comes only after you've already survived your death once. By noon, Ava traced one last transaction from Bianca's Zurich account, a wire transfer of $3 million, to a Canadian bank, under the alias MT Trust Management. "There's our phantom," Marcus said. "MT isn't a company, it's a person." "Then we find them," I said. "And we make sure Bianca's not far behind." 3 days later, we were on a small charter plane to Vancouver. The air was sharp, and the sky glowed the color of steel. Marcus briefed me during the flight. According to Ava, MT is listed as a consultant for several trust firms. But there's no photo, no social profile. Only initials, MT. "Initials can hide a lot," I murmured. "But handwriting doesn't." He frowned. "What do you mean? I've seen those initials before. On the bottom of Project Pacific reports. The approved signature." The handwriting was elegant, slanted, careful. I paused. It wasn't Bianca's. Marcus's brow furrowed. "You think it's someone she worked for, or someone she feared," I said. The plane dipped lower, slicing through mist. Below us, the bay stretched like a mirror, gray and endless. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Every step I took toward the truth felt like walking back into the same ocean that almost killed me, but this time I was the one choosing to dive. When we landed, the city was quiet under light snow. We rented an old sedan and drove to an address linked to MT Trust Management, a modest building near Cole Harbor, glass-fronted with a single plaque that read, "Henderson and Meyer Advisory." Inside, everything smelled of polish and old paper. A receptionist looked up, startled. Marcus flashed a bureau credential. "We're here to see MT." She hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," I said smoothly. "We're expected." She typed something into her system, then nodded reluctantly. "Top floor." Suite 802. The elevator ride felt endless. The soft hum of machinery mixed with the distant echo of my heartbeat. When the doors opened, we stepped into a suite that looked more like a gallery than an office. Paintings, fresh orchids, soft music playing from somewhere unseen. And then I saw her. A woman in her late 50s, tall, impeccably dressed with hair the color of ash and eyes the color of winter glass. She looked up from her desk and smiled like she'd been expecting me. "Mrs. Grant," she said, voice smooth, cultured. "It's an honor to meet the woman who ruined my best client." "Then you must be MT," I said. "Margaret Torres," she corrected. "Or as you know me, Project Pacific's architect." Marcus's hand moved toward his pocket, but she raised a palm. "Please. I'm unarmed. Violence isn't my language." "What is?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Control." I stepped closer, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. "You built an empire on death. I built efficiency," she said calmly. "Do you know how many billions sit idle because their owners cling to outdated wills and failing bodies? I streamlined legacy. I turned mortality into movement. Into murder," I said. She tilted her head. "Semantics." Marcus's phone buzzed quietly. Ava's voice came through his earpiece. "We've got her signal. Everything's recording. Keep her talking." I folded my arms. "And what about Bianca? She was your front. Did you plan to let her rot while you vanished into the snow?" Margaret's eyes glimmered. "Bianca was a necessary mask. But she grew sentimental. Started to believe she could own the system. That's when she became expendable. Like the rest of us," I said. "Not you," she replied. "You were the masterpiece. The only case that went wrong. You were supposed to validate the system, not expose it." I felt the room tilt slightly, her words pressing against me. "You orchestrated my death. I orchestrated your freedom," she said softly. "Death is a clean slate, Mrs. Grant. You should have stayed gone." Marcus stepped forward, his voice hard. "The Bureau has every file you sent to Mercer and Morales. You're finished." She laughed lightly. "Oh, Agent Hale. The Bureau works for my clients. The moment they realize who's really on that list, you'll lose your badge." Marcus didn't flinch, but I saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "You think money will protect you? It won't. The world knows my name now. They'll know yours next." She stood unhurried and walked to the window overlooking the harbor. "You think they care about justice, they only care about spectacle. You gave them a show, Mrs. Grant, and now you'll fade again. The audience always moves on." I walked up beside her. "Maybe. But this time I'm not the one falling overboard." For a moment our reflections met in the glass, two women carved by power, one by survival, one by greed. Then Marcus's phone vibrated again. "Eleanor," he said sharply, "they're moving on her accounts right now. Someone tipped her off. Half the funds are transferring to offshore safes." Margaret smiled. "You're too late." I turned to her. "Not quite." I pulled the small pendant from around my neck, pressing the hidden button. The sound of static filled the room, followed by Ava's voice echoing through the speakers. "This is Special Agent Ava Price, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Margaret Torres, your conversation has been live-streamed to federal servers. Every word you've said is now public record." Her face drained of color for the first time. "You wouldn't dare." "I already did," I said. Marcus moved toward her. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, murder by proxy, and obstruction of justice." She backed away, hands shaking slightly. "You think this ends with me? You think cutting off one head stops the serpent?" "No," I said. "But it's a start." As he cuffed her, she leaned close to me and whispered, "There's always another storm coming, Eleanor. You just don't know where from." I met her gaze steadily. "Then I'll keep my sails up." Outside, the snow fell harder, soft flakes swirling like ashes. The world felt quieter somehow, as if holding its breath. When we stepped back onto the street, Marcus looked at me. "You didn't have to risk it all like that." "Yes, I did," I said. She needed to see that the woman she tried to erase was the one writing her ending. We stood there for a long moment, the city lights reflecting off the harbor, the cold air stinging but clean. Marcus exhaled. You realize this isn't the end, right? There'll be hearings, trials, appeals. I know, I said. But for the first time, the right people will have to answer. We started walking toward the car, snow crunching under our boots. The world was still dangerous, still full of sharks, but for once I wasn't the one bleeding. Somewhere behind us in the distance, the sirens began to wail. And for the first time in a very long time I felt the sound wasn't coming for me. The trial of Margaret Torres began in late spring, when the cherry blossoms along the courthouse steps had already begun to fall. Reporters lined the street like vultures, microphones thrust forward as if they could capture justice by sheer persistence. The air smelled of wet petals and anticipation. I stood at the top of the steps, the same navy coat wrapped tight around me. Marcus walked beside me, his badge tucked discreetly into his jacket. "You don't have to testify today," he said. "We already have the confession." "I'm not here for her," I said quietly. "I'm here for everyone she buried." Inside the courtroom was cold and sterile, the hum of cameras hidden behind glass. Margaret sat at the defense table calm as ever, a cream suit pressed and spotless. She looked like she was attending a charity luncheon, not a federal trial. When she saw me, her eyes flickered, amusement, disdain, and perhaps the faintest trace of admiration. "Mrs. Grant," she said smoothly, as I passed. "Still breathing, I see." "Still winning," I replied. The judge called the room to order. The prosecution began with the files. Ava and Marcus had uncovered financial ledgers, false medical records, hidden trusts, labeled Pacific assets. Each piece fit together like a puzzle whose picture was finally clear. But it wasn't the documents that silenced the crowd. It was the names. 39 of them. All read aloud in a voice that trembled slightly but never broke. When the prosecutor reached mine, I met Margaret's gaze. She didn't look away. "Mrs. Eleanor Grant," the attorney said, "survived an attempted homicide disguised as an accident. Her testimony will establish intent." I took the stand, my palms cold against the wood. The microphone caught my breath as I began. "They thought I was an inconvenience," I said. "Too old to matter, too rich to protect. I wasn't supposed to wake up that night in the water. But I did. And every moment since has been about making sure no one else falls into the same silence." As I spoke, the gallery stayed utterly still. I described the smell of the sea, the weight of betrayal, the way my son's eyes had turned to glass. I told them about the files labeled Project Pacific, about Bianca's fall, about the network of greed wrapped in polite signatures. When I finished, the judge nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant. Please step down." As I passed Margaret's table, she whispered, "You've doomed us both." I leaned slightly toward her. "No, Margaret. You doomed yourself the day you called murder efficiency." Outside the courthouse, the media surged forward, flashes cutting through the cloudy afternoon. Marcus shielded me as microphones shouted questions. "How did you survive? What will happen to your son? Do you forgive them?" I didn't answer. Some truths don't belong in soundbites. That night, back in the safe house, the wind beat against the windows again. Lydia had made soup her way of keeping normalcy alive. "The world's calling you a hero," she said. I shook my head. Heroes save people. I just refuse to stay buried. Marcus sat across from me, scrolling through the latest updates. "Kane's been arrested in Zurich. The rest of the Pacific accounts are frozen. Every dollar they stole will be returned." I smiled faintly. Money comes and goes. What matters is the record stays. He hesitated before asking, "And Ethan?" The question hung heavy between us. My son had pleaded guilty to obstruction and fraud. His testimony against Bianca and Margaret had helped the Bureau, but it didn't cleanse the memory of that day on the yacht. "He'll serve his sentence," I said finally. 5 years. After that, I don't know. Marcus nodded. "You could visit him. If you wanted." "I will," I said. "But not yet. Some wounds need silence before forgiveness." The days that followed blurred into hearings, paperwork, statements. The media frenzy turned into fascination. They called it the Pacific Widow case. Documentaries aired, podcasts bloomed, strangers wrote letters saying my story gave them courage to speak against their own families, their employers, their abusers. One letter stood out. A woman in Louisiana wrote, "My daughter took my house after my stroke. I thought I had no power left. Then I saw your video. Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive. I cried reading it, not for myself but for all the quiet battles no one films. 2 months later, the verdict came. The courtroom was packed again. Margaret Torres stood as the judge read. On all counts, conspiracy, fraud and homicide, you are found guilty. Sentence life without parole. For the first time she showed emotion. Not fear, rage. You think this stops anything, she said. You can't stop power. It only changes hands. I met her gaze calmly. Then I'll teach the next hands what it costs. Afterward, I walked alone along the waterfront behind the courthouse. The air was cold, the tide high. I watched the waves lap against the stone wall, steady and relentless. Somewhere across that same sea I had almost died. And yet here I was. Marcus found me there, hands in his pockets. It's done, he said. I nodded. Almost. He frowned. Almost. There's still the matter of rebuilding, I said. The name Grant used to mean greed. Maybe it can mean integrity again. You could start a foundation, he said. Use the recovered funds. That's the idea, I said. For victims of inheritance fraud. For anyone who was told they didn't have a voice. He smiled. That's poetic justice. It's survival turned into purpose, I said softly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The kind that doesn't erase pain but transforms it into something lighter. Lydia met us back at the car, her eyes warm. You did it, she said. We did, I corrected. That evening we celebrated quietly, no champagne, no speeches. Just soup, laughter, and a fire that finally burned without fear. Before going to bed, I opened my old journal, the one Robert had given me decades ago. On the first page, his handwriting still shone faintly. For when you need to remember who you are. I took a pen and wrote, beneath it, I am the woman who came back. Then for the first time in years I slept deeply without the sound of waves chasing me. The next morning I woke to birds outside the window. The sky was clear, the water calm. Marcus was already gone back to D.C. His note on the counter short and steady, justice served. See you at the foundation launch. I smiled and poured myself coffee. The world outside still carried scars, but it was living again, and so was I. Before I left the house, I stood at the door, hand on the knob, and whispered, Robert, it's over. A breeze stirred the curtains as if in reply. And for the first time since the yacht, I felt free. 3 months after the verdict, the Grant Foundation officially opened its doors in downtown Seattle. The morning sun glowed through the tall windows, catching the brass plaque by the entrance. The Eleanor Grant Foundation for Justice and Financial Recovery. Beneath it, smaller words shimmered in gold, restoring voices erased by greed. People filled the lobby, survivors, journalists, attorneys, and quiet faces who had once been victims themselves. Lydia stood near the front desk holding a bouquet of lilies. She smiled when she saw me step out of the elevator. You look beautiful, Eleanor. Robert would be proud. I hope so, I said softly. He believed wealth meant responsibility. I just wish I'd remembered that sooner. Marcus appeared behind her, his usual crisp suit, slightly wrinkled for once. The press is waiting, he said. And the bureau's here too. Apparently your story turned into a national training module on financial abuse. I laughed lightly. So I've become a case study, more like a legend, he said. Not many people bring down an entire criminal network with a hidden microphone and sheer stubbornness. I gave him a look. It wasn't stubbornness, it was survival. He nodded. Same thing sometimes. Inside the hall, cameras flashed as I took the podium. When I fell into the ocean that night, I began. I thought my story had ended. But the truth is, sometimes the waves don't take you, they return you to shore with a purpose. Today, that purpose has a name. The crowd applauded. I saw faces in the audience that carried their own storms, an elderly man who'd lost his home to his son's forged will, a widow defrauded by her lawyer, a woman who whispered later that she'd been afraid to speak until she saw my video. This foundation, I continued, isn't about revenge. It's about redemption for those who were told they were too old, too weak, too late. It's for anyone who's ever been silenced by power. After the ceremony, Marcus and I stepped out into the courtyard where cherry blossoms were falling again, the petals soft against the stone path. He lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it, letting the smoke curl into the sky. You did it, he said quietly. You turned pain into something that saves people. I looked at him. No, Marcus. We did it. Without you, I'd still be a headline or worse. He smiled faintly. You ever think about leaving all this behind, writing a book maybe? You'd sell 1,000,000 copies. Books end, I said. Lives don't. As we walked back inside, Lydia waved me over to where a young woman was waiting by the reception desk. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hands shook slightly as she held out an envelope. Mrs. Grant, she said. My grandmother was one of the names on that list. The people Margaret Torres called transfers. She never got justice. But because of you, our family did. Thank you. I took the envelope, feeling the tremor in her voice, the echo of something I'd once carried too. You don't owe me thanks, I said. Just promise me you'll never let silence protect cruelty. She nodded, eyes glistening. That night after everyone had gone, I stayed behind in the empty office. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass reflections dancing on the polished floor. I walked through the rows of desks past framed photos of those we'd helped already, faces once forgotten, now documented with dignity. In my office the window overlooked Puget Sound. The water was dark, endless, alive. I could almost hear Robert's laugh echoing through memory, could almost smell the sea spray from that night. I refused to die. The door opened softly. Marcus leaned in. You're still here. I can't seem to leave, I said with a smile. Maybe part of me still doesn't believe it's real. He crossed his arms. You earned this, Eleanor. All of it. Justice isn't something you earn, I said. It's something you fight for again and again. Like breathing. He nodded slowly. You know, I got the final report from Zurich. They found more names, 10 additional estates linked to Torres's system. She'd been running it longer than anyone guessed. I felt my chest tighten. Will the families get closure? They will now, he said. Your testimony opened every door. No one's covering for them anymore. Silence stretched between us for a moment, the kind of silence that holds gratitude and exhaustion at once. Finally, he said, there's something else. Ethan's been moved to a halfway facility for cooperation. He requested a visit. The words hit like a slow wave. He wants to see me. Yes, Marcus said gently. You don't have to go, but he's trying, Eleanor. Maybe for the first time. I turned toward the window. The reflection staring back wasn't the same woman who'd once stood trembling on the yacht's deck. My hair had gone whiter, my eyes clearer. Time hadn't softened me, but it had made me see what mattered. Set it up, I said quietly. The next afternoon, I drove to the rehabilitation center outside Tacoma. The air was thick with pine and salt. When I entered the visitor's room, Ethan was already there, thinner, older eyes, hollow but human again. Mom, he said, voice cracking. Ethan. He stood uncertain, then sat again. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I thought I was doing what Dad would have wanted. I thought money was the only way to keep us safe. Money doesn't keep anyone safe, I said softly. It just tells you who's dangerous. He nodded, tears filling his eyes. I miss him. I miss you. You had me, I said. You just didn't want to see me as a person. You saw me as an obstacle. I was wrong, he whispered. Every day in here I think about that. About you falling into the water. I dream about it. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his trembling one. You can't undo what's been done, Ethan. But you can decide who you'll be when you walk out of here. He looked up, eyes wet. Who should I be? Someone who tells the truth, I said. Even when it hurts. For a long time neither of us moved. The air between us was full of years of laughter, distance, betrayal, and something fragile beginning to rebuild. When I left, the sky was bruised purple and the scent of rain hung heavy. I sat in the car watching the reflection of the prison lights on the windshield. For the first time I didn't feel anger. Only sorrow and maybe a little hope. That night back home, I lit a single candle by the window. The flame flickered, tiny and fierce, like the pulse of something reborn. Lydia came in quietly. How was it hard? I said. Necessary. She nodded. Closure always is. We stood there in silence, the city humming below us, the water glimmering beyond. I used to think survival was the end, I said, finally. But it isn't. It's the beginning. Lydia smiled softly. Then what comes next? I looked out at the bay, the same water that once tried to claim me. Whatever the tide brings, I said. Outside, the moon rose slow and full over the soundlight, scattering across the surface like shards of silver. And for the first time, I didn't see the sea as an enemy. I saw it as a mirror, vast, restless, and alive just like me. The morning of the Foundation's first anniversary came with a rare kind of quiet. The city outside my window was still wrapped in a soft mist that blurred the skyline. For the first time in years, I woke without the sound of the ocean crashing through my dreams. I brewed coffee, walked to the window and let the smell of rain drift in. The bay looked calm, almost forgiving. Lydia arrived early, carrying 2 boxes of fresh pastries and a grin that could light a room. 1 year, she said, 1 full year of helping people who thought they were invisible. Not invisible anymore, I said, taking a pastry and smiling. Sometimes ghosts can teach the living how to see. By mid-morning, the lobby of the Foundation filled with people. Survivors, advocates and new faces, people who had once been on the edge of losing everything, now came to share what they'd rebuilt. The energy was warm, almost celebratory. Marcus stood near the entrance, shaking hands and pretending he wasn't uncomfortable in a suit without a badge. "You'll never admit it," I said when I joined him, "but you like this." He smirked. "Paperwork without a chase, not my thing. But watching you turn an ocean of pain into something useful, that I'll take." Across the room, a young reporter set up a camera. "Mrs. Grant, can we get a few words for the live broadcast?" "Of course." I straightened my jacket, the navy one that had survived every courtroom and interview. "When I started this foundation," I began, "I didn't imagine it would grow this quickly. But that's the thing about truth, it spreads. And once you tell it, others start to find their voices too." The crowd applauded. Behind the flash of cameras, I saw faces that reminded me of why this mattered. A widow from Chicago whose children had stolen her estate. A veteran's daughter who fought to recover her father's pension. People who had lived in silence until they heard my story and realized they weren't alone. After the event, Marcus and I slipped away to the rooftop garden. The air smelled of jasmine and sea salt. He handed me a small envelope. "From the Bureau," he said. "The official closure of Project Pacific." I opened it, scanning the document. All defendants convicted. Assets redistributed to victims and charities. Case sealed under federal record. "It's done," Marcus said. I exhaled slowly. I never thought I'd see the day. "You earned it," he said. "You turned survival into reform. That's more than most agents do in a lifetime." I looked out at the horizon, the sun breaking through the mist. "Justice isn't a moment, Marcus. It's a tide. You can't stop it, you can only hope it moves in the right direction." He chuckled. "You're going to start quoting yourself now, aren't you?" Maybe, I said with a smile. "It saves me from bad interviews." Later that afternoon, I returned to my office. A letter sat on my desk unmarked. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, steady, masculine, deliberate. "Dear Mom, I'm not writing to ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know, I've started working with the rehabilitation program. They asked me to help teach financial literacy to families who've lost someone to fraud. Every time I stand in front of them, I think of you. You taught me everything about building trust, I just forgot what it meant. I'm remembering now. I hope one day I can show you who I've become. Love, Ethan." I read it twice, then folded it gently. The edges of my heart ached, but not from anger. From something softer. Something that felt like release. That evening, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed, I walked through the quiet halls of the Foundation. The photos on the walls glowed softly in the lamplight, portraits of those who'd rebuilt their lives, each one a reminder that survival was contagious. Lydia met me by the door, coat over her arm. "You're staying late again." "Old habits," I said. "The ghosts get restless when it's quiet." She smiled knowingly. "Then, let them keep you company." When she left, I went to the balcony, the city stretching below me like a constellation. The sea breeze lifted the hem of my scarf, the same silk one Robert had given me all those years ago. I could almost hear his voice in the wind. "You were always stronger than you thought." I whispered back, "I finally believe you." A knock came at the office door behind me. Marcus leaned in. "I figured you'd still be here. I brought you something." He handed me a small silver pendant, an identical replacement for the one that had recorded Bianca's confession. I thought you'd want a reminder, he said. Not of them, but of the moment you took your power back. I closed my hand around it. Thank you, he smiled. You're not planning to get thrown off another yacht anytime soon, right? Not unless it's my own and the champagne's worth the risk, I said dryly. He laughed, then turned serious. You know, I still get messages about you. People asking how you did it, how you kept fighting. Tell them I didn't fight alone, I said. And that surviving isn't about strength, it's about choosing not to disappear. The clock struck 9. The city lights shimmered like tiny lighthouses on the horizon. Marcus lingered a moment longer before heading out. Good night, Mrs. Grant. Good night, Agent Hale, I said softly, even though he hadn't been one in months. Alone again, I opened my journal, the same one that had survived the salt water, the fire, the fear. The pages smelled faintly of ocean air. I wrote slowly, each word deliberate. Robert, the tide has turned. The people who used the law to destroy others now face the same justice they mocked. Ethan is learning slowly. I'm proud of him, not for what he did, but for what he's trying to undo. As for me, I've finally stopped counting what I've lost. I'm too busy building what comes next. I closed the journal and looked out over the water. The bay was black and shining, the surface rippling with faint light. Somewhere out there, the sea that once tried to take me was still moving, still powerful, but it no longer scared me. It reminded me I was alive. I lifted my phone and opened the Foundation's livestream. Good evening, everyone, I said softly into the camera. It's Eleanor Grant. I just wanted to thank you for staying with me this far. When I started telling my story, I didn't know anyone would listen. But you did, and because of that, others are speaking too. I paused, letting the words settle. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this voice has reached. The screen began filling instantly. Atlanta, Portland, Dublin, Manila, Nairobi. A smile broke across my face. If my story touched you, share it with someone who still thinks it's too late to start again. Because if a woman can crawl out of the ocean they tried to bury her in, then you can rise too. I looked straight into the lens, steady and warm. I'm Eleanor Grant, I'm still here, and so are you. The comments kept flooding in. Hearts, prayers, thank yous. I ended the stream, set the phone down, and watched the water shimmer in the moonlight. Somewhere far below, the tide shifted again, rolling gently toward the shore. And I knew at last that my story had come full circle, not a tale of drowning but of surfacing, not about revenge but rebirth. The night settled around me, quiet and kind. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and whispered to the dark, "Sleep well, Robert. The world is quiet now." Then I turned off the light, leaving only the view of the sea, calm and endless, the same sea that once swallowed me, now carrying my reflection like a promise kept.